Her name was Ozioma Achebe, and she had already accepted that she might not survive the evening. She poured the wine anyway. 47 floors above a city of 10 million people, inside a dining room that did not officially exist, a woman whose name no one had ever asked was about to dismantle an assassination plot using a 4-second pour and a grain of chemistry smaller than a rice kernel. The man she was about to save had looked through her for 11 weeks straight. The man she was about to destroy was sitting 3 feet away, watching his own poison being served, and smiling. Neither of them knew what she had done. Neither of them ever would. But before the night ended, one of them would be dead, and the other would owe his life to a woman whose face he had never bothered to memorize. This is not a story about poison. This is a story about what happens when the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one is watching. And by the time you finish this video, you will understand why she was always going to win, and why the men who built empires on her invisibility never stood a chance. The 47th floor of the Hanol Tower did not appear on any directory. No elevator button announced it. The main lobby's directional signage skipped from 46 to 48 as though the floor had simply been forgotten by the architects. Access required a keycard, a rotating 6-digit code, and the physical presence of someone who answered to one man. That man was Kwon Sung-jin. For 23 years, he had built an empire on a single principle: power flows downward. The people who poured his wine, folded his napkins, and opened his doors were not in the same category of human as the people he negotiated with. They were furniture. Useful furniture. Sometimes attractive furniture. But furniture. That principle had kept him alive through 3 rival wars, 2 federal investigations, and 1 attempted coup from inside his own organization. The men who tried to remove him had all underestimated the same thing: the depth of his network, the patience of his planning, the speed of his retribution. None of them had ever underestimated his staff. Because none of them had ever thought to. Tonight, that pattern would break. Tonight, the threat had not been sent by a rival. The threat had been hired by one. The threat had walked into the building 11 weeks ago carrying nothing but a falsified employment record and a willingness to disappear. And the threat was, at this exact moment, standing 20 feet away from him, wearing the same uniform as every other person who had served him dinner for the past 2 decades. He had no idea. The narrow hallway leading to the dining room was a deliberate piece of architecture. Wide enough for one person. Too confined for an ambush. The carpet absorbed footsteps. The walls dampened sound. 3 security cameras tracked every meter of the corridor, their feeds monitored from a suite on the 45th floor by 2 men who answered exclusively to one person. Park Do-han. At 7:45 p.m., Park Do-han completed his 3rd sweep of the room. Former military intelligence. 15 years in personal protection. 2 prevented assassinations on his record, one by a sniper at a coastal hotel in 2019, one by a man with a ceramic blade at a nightclub in Busan in 2022. Both attempts had been executed by trained professionals. Both had been detected by Park Do-han within seconds of beginning. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the best at his job in East Asia. He checked the undersides of every chair. He scanned the baseboards for listening devices. He verified the locks on the concealed service corridor. He confirmed the integrity of every window, bulletproof, and incapable of opening regardless. He did not check the staff. In his framework, threats came from professionals, operatives, rivals, men with training and resources. The people who carried trays were not in that framework. He had verified their badges at the elevator, glanced at their faces long enough to confirm the photographs matched, and then dismissed them from his tactical awareness entirely. That dismissal was about to cost his employer everything. The strange truth about the human eye is this: it does not see what is in front of it. It sees what it has been trained to look for. A trained predator scans for prey. A trained professional scans for threats. A trained child scans for warmth. And every act of scanning carries with it a corresponding act of editing. The brain decides, in real time, what is worth registering and what should be erased before it ever reaches the level of conscious thought. For Park Do-han, the service staff had been edited out of perception years ago. For Kwon Sung-jin, they had never been included to begin with. For Ozioma Achebe, this was not an oversight. It was an entire architecture of opportunity. She was not what she appeared to be. She had never been what she appeared to be. The badge clipped to her vest read Ozioma A, Private Dining Services, Employee Number 4471, and every detail on it was accurate, verified, and traceable through the proper systems. Her tax records were clean. Her background check had returned green. Her references were genuine, 3 former employers, all real establishments in the city's hospitality industry, all of whom would confirm she had worked for them between specific dates and had been an exemplary employee. What none of those references would mention was that, during her time at each of those establishments, she had been preparing, studying, watching, cataloging the rituals of wealthy men, memorizing the choreography of high-end service, building the muscle memory of a profession she had never intended to remain in for longer than the time it took to complete a specific task. At 8 p.m. exactly, Kwon Sung-jin entered the dining room. He walked the way a man walks into his own living room, no scan, no adjustment, no acknowledgement that the space had existed before he entered. His shoulders were square. His hands were at his sides, not in his pockets, not clasped, not holding anything. Power, in its most evolved form, requires no props. He took his seat at the head of the black walnut table. Park Do-han slid the chair forward with one hand while sweeping the room with the other, a choreographed gesture they had performed hundreds of times. It communicated hierarchy without a word. Kwon did not thank him. Park did not expect to be thanked. Then the service staff entered. 3 of them. Single file. Through the concealed door behind the velvet curtain. 2 men, 1 woman. Identical uniforms. Identical posture. Identical professionally blank faces. The woman was second in line. She did not look up as she entered. She did not look at the principal. She did not look at the security chief. She moved with the rehearsed economy of someone who had performed this same physical sequence so many times that the actions had become invisible even to her own conscious mind. Her eyes, however, were not idle. While her chin was lowered, her gaze was performing the exact same lateral sweep of the room that Park Do-han had used 30 minutes earlier. She was checking the camera angles. She was confirming the position of each person in the room. She was measuring distances. She was timing her own breathing against the rhythm of the chandelier's faint, almost imperceptible electrical hum. Park Do-han glanced at her for exactly 1.5 seconds. His gaze moved across her the way it moved across the curtains, registering her presence as part of the environment and nothing more. He did not notice that her eyes were active. He did not notice the controlled rhythm of her breath. He did not notice that her left hand, while appearing to rest naturally at her side, was positioned with the index finger angled in a manner that suggested something concealed beneath the pad of her thumb. He saw a waitress. That is what he had been trained to see. That is what he saw. She had been doing this for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of folding napkins. 11 weeks of pouring water. 11 weeks of disappearing into the service corridor before anyone at any table had formed a complete memory of her face. But the 11 weeks had not started with the job. The 11 weeks had been the final stage. The first stage had begun 9 months earlier, in a small apartment in a neighborhood she would never publicly admit having lived in, with a man she would never publicly admit having met. His name was Emeka Abiyanju. He was not her employer in the conventional sense. He was not paying her. He was not commanding her. He was, in his own description, simply facilitating an opportunity, connecting her to a problem she had the unique skills to solve. The problem had a name. The name was Kwon Sung-jin. And the reason that name needed to be addressed had nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with revenge, and nothing to do with politics. It had to do with a transaction that had occurred 18 years earlier, a transaction that Ozioma had spent half her adult life waiting for the opportunity to reverse. But that part of the story was not for tonight. Tonight was about the wine. If you've ever been the person no one watches in a room full of people who think they matter, this story is for you. Hit subscribe before you forget, because what happens in the next 10 minutes will change how you see every powerful person in your life. Drop a single word in the comments, watching. Let's count how many of us refuse to be invisible anymore. To understand what happened during those 19 seconds at the table, you have to understand what happened during the 11 weeks before them. Because the act itself was the smallest part of the operation. The employment record had been the easiest part. A woman named Ozioma Achebe had genuinely existed within the city's hospitality network for over 2 years before her placement at Hanul Tower. She had genuinely worked at 3 legitimate establishments, a hotel restaurant on the river, a private members club in the financial district, and a catering company that served diplomatic functions. Her references were real. Her tax filings were real. Her social security record was real. The only thing that was not real was the reason she had taken those jobs. Each placement had been chosen for a specific reason. The hotel taught her the cadence of room service. The members club taught her the choreography of private dining for men who value discretion above all else. The catering company taught her how to move through high-security environments, diplomatic residences, government functions, restricted hotel floors, without ever triggering the awareness of the security personnel monitoring those spaces. Each environment was an academy. Each shift was a rehearsal. By the time she applied for the position at Hanul Tower's private dining services, she had served wine to 3 former cabinet ministers, 2 ambassadors, 1 chairman of a top 5 conglomerate, and 17 men whose names did not appear in any public registry but who controlled more capital than most national economies. None of them had ever asked her name. That had been the point. Margaret Solan, the head of private dining operations, a tall thin white woman in her late 50s with silver blonde hair pinned in a precise French twist, narrow face, pale blue eyes behind frameless glasses, charcoal gray blazer over cream blouse, small gold brooch on her left lapel, leather-bound clipboard always in hand, had reviewed Ozioma's application personally. The application had been impeccable. References had been called. Background checks had been run through the building's external screening firm, a third-party security contractor that performed the same depth of investigation used for federal employment positions. Everything had returned green. Margaret had approved the placement without reservation. She had assigned Ozioma to the rotating waitstaff pool, a category of employee whose specific shift assignments were determined week by week, depending on which private events were scheduled, which clients had requested specific service requirements, and which staff members had availability. This rotational assignment system was, by design, intended to prevent any single staff member from developing predictable access to any single client. It was a security measure. And like all security measures designed by institutions, it could be reverse-engineered by anyone patient enough to study its patterns. Ozioma had spent her first 3 weeks at Hanul Tower memorizing the rotation algorithm. She had identified the specific weeks when staff turnover created scheduling pressure. She had identified the specific senior staff members whose vacation requests created openings on the high-security floors. She had identified the specific events, Tuesday evening private dinners on the 47th floor, recurring approximately every 4 weeks, that consistently triggered a request for an additional server. By the end of week 5, she had positioned herself in the rotation pool with the kind of carefully cultivated reliability that made her the obvious selection for any unexpected assignment. By week 6, she had been called to the 47th floor for the first time. By week 11, she had served on that floor 4 separate times, observing, cataloging, mapping. And tonight, week 11, dinner number 5, was the night the entire operation had been pointing toward from the beginning. But before tonight could happen, she had needed to know what was already in the wine. Because she was not the only operator who had penetrated the building. She was simply the only one who had penetrated it without being noticed. 4 months earlier, in a private estate cellar in the Burgundy region of France, a sealed bottle of vintage red had been intercepted. The interception had occurred during the gap between bottling and shipping, a window of less than 72 hours during which the bottle was technically the property of the producer but had not yet been logged into the International Shipping Registry. During that gap, a substance had been introduced. The bottle had been resealed using equipment that produced a perfect replica of the original cork, the original wax, the original label. By the time the bottle entered the shipping chain, it was indistinguishable from any other bottle in its production lot. It had passed through 3 temperature-controlled checkpoints, Rotterdam, Singapore, Seoul, without raising any concern. It had been delivered to the bonded courier service contracted by Hainault Tower's private dining operations 48 hours before the scheduled dinner. It had been verified by the building's certified sommelier, a man with 11 years of service to the Quan organization, who had inspected the seal, examined the wax, confirmed the producer's mark, and approved the bottle for service. Everything about the bottle was correct. Except for what was inside it. The substance inside the bottle had been engineered for a specific outcome. It was undetectable by standard inspection methods. It produced no change in color, taste, or aroma. It bonded chemically with the tannins of aged red wine in a manner that disguised its presence even under sophisticated analysis. And it was designed to act on a delay, somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes after ingestion, depending on the body weight and metabolic rate of the person who consumed it. In that delay window, the substance would produce a sequence of physiological events that would terminate the life of the consumer in a manner that medical examination would record as a sudden cardiac event. Untraceable. Unattributable. Catastrophic. This is what the wine on the table contained. This is what Kwon Sung-jin was about to drink. This is what Ozioma Achebe had been hired, not by Kwon, not for Kwon, but adjacent to Kwon's interests in a way that Kwon would never understand, to neutralize. The man who had paid for the wine to be compromised was sitting at the table. His name was Yoon Ha-jin. He was the leader of the Yoon Syndicate, the only rival faction reckless enough to challenge the Kwon organization openly, and the only one with the financial resources to construct an operation of this complexity. He had spent 4 months coordinating the supply chain interception, the substance procurement, the bonded courier infiltration, and the timing of his own arrival at the dinner. He had come tonight to negotiate a merger that would absorb his organization into Kwon's. He had come tonight to die surviving it. The plan, as Yoon understood it, was elegant. He would arrive. He would negotiate. He would drink as little as possible. He would wait for Kwon to drink. He would observe Kwon's collapse. And he would walk out of Hainault Tower as the only living head of an organized syndicate in the city, having eliminated his rival without ever raising a hand, without ever being in the same room as a weapon, without ever leaving any evidence that connected him to the death. The plan, as Yoon did not understand it, had one flaw. His own organization had been infiltrated. And the woman he had never noticed, the woman pouring water at the periphery of his vision, had known about the wine for 6 months. She had not been hired to protect Kwon Sung-jin. She had been hired to protect someone else, someone whose financial interests would be catastrophically destabilized if Kwon died this evening. The death of one syndicate leader at the hands of another would trigger a wave of restructuring across 3 industries, for shipping routes, and a constellation of private financial instruments that her actual employer needed to remain stable for at least another 18 months. Kwon's survival was not her objective. Kwon's survival was the byproduct of her objective. The distinction mattered. Because it meant she was not a guardian. She was not a protector. She was an operator executing a single, narrowly defined task, and everything outside that task, including the question of what would happen to Yoon Ha-jin once his own poison began to act on him, was none of her concern. She had not been tasked with warning him. She had not been tasked with protecting him. She had been tasked with one objective. She would accomplish it in 19 seconds. The neutralizing agent had been delivered to her by Emeka Abiyanju 6 weeks before her placement at Hainault Tower. She did not know its precise chemical structure. She did not need to. She knew its category. She knew its behavior. She knew its timeline. And she knew that it would bind to the specific compound in the wine and convert it into something the human body would process and excrete without consequence. The agent itself was the size of a single droplet, sealed inside a micro-container no larger than a grain of rice. The container was secured beneath the pad of her left index finger using a specialized adhesive that was undetectable to the kind of pat-down search that Hanol Tower's security personnel were authorized to perform on staff. It would release on a single deliberate press of her thumbnail. It required less pressure than clicking a ballpoint pen. The window to deploy it would last exactly 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds would happen during the pour itself, when every eye in the room would be locked on the wine, on the color, on the descent of liquid into crystal. She had practiced this 470 times. Not 400. Not 500. 470. The number was not the point. The number was the symptom. The point was that she had built her body into a delivery system so reliable that the action would happen below the threshold of conscious decision. It would happen the way breathing happens. The way blinking happens. The way the heart contracts. She had practiced left-handed and right-handed. She had practiced while reciting standardized service phrases, "Would you care for more, sir?" to ensure her voice remained steady during execution. She had practiced in front of mirrors. She had practiced while tired. She had practiced while hungry. She had practiced after sleep deprivation, after physical exertion, after sustained silence. She had practiced under every condition she could imagine, except the one she could not simulate. The condition of being in the room with him. The condition of being 3 feet away from a man whose existence had defined her life for 18 years, while wearing the uniform of someone he would not deign to look at. That condition could not be rehearsed. That condition could only be survived. At 8:14 p.m., Kwon Sung-jin spoke a single word. Pour. One word. Not addressed to anyone specifically. Released into the room like a command from a position so elevated that specificity was unnecessary. Ozioma stepped forward. The patience required to spend 9 months preparing for 19 seconds is the kind most people will never understand. If you do, if you've ever been the slow strategist in a world of fast reactors, drop a comment below, "I see her." Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because the next 4 minutes contain the most precise act of psychological theater you will ever watch. She lifted the decanter. The weight was correct. The temperature was correct, 15 degrees Celsius, the ideal serving temperature for aged Burgundy. She felt the familiar balance point in her palm, the one she had memorized 11 days earlier when she had served a different set of men at a different negotiation that had ended without incident. She tilted the decanter over Kwon's glass. The wine descended in a thin, controlled stream. 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, every person in the room performed their assigned role in a choreography none of them had ever discussed. Kwon watched the wine. Yoon watched Kwon. Park watched Yoon. No one watched her left hand. The pour was a ceremony. Ceremonies command attention the way a conductor's baton commands an orchestra. The eyes are drawn to the descent of liquid, the formation of the meniscus, the rise of the wine's aroma, and the brain, in those 4 seconds, allocates virtually all of its perceptual resources to the central event. Anything happening at the periphery becomes invisible. Anything happening at the periphery becomes possible. The agent dissolved on contact. It produced no visible reaction. The wine continued to descend at the same rate. The color remained unchanged. The aroma remained unchanged. The viscosity remained unchanged. Anyone watching the glass, and several people were, saw exactly what they expected to see, a competent server pouring a fine wine for a powerful man. What they did not see was the chemistry occurring in the descending stream. The agent bound to the active molecules of the foreign compound. It folded them. It restructured them. It converted them into a series of inert byproducts that would pass through a human body without producing any physiological effect more dramatic than mild thirst. By the time the wine settled in the glass, the substance that had been engineered 4 months earlier in a private cellar in Burgundy had been functionally erased. Kwon Sung-jin was now drinking ordinary wine. He did not know it. The man who had paid for the substance to be introduced did not know it either. Only Ozioma knew. And she returned the decanter to the silver tray with the calm, unhurried efficiency of a woman who had just completed a single task in a long evening of routine work. She moved to Yoon's glass. She poured. She did not alter that one. The decision had not required deliberation. It had been made months ago, in a small apartment with Emika Abayanju, when the operational parameters had been finalized. Her objective was the protection of Kwon's life. Yoon's life was outside her objective. Whatever the consequences of his own plan, those consequences were his to inherit. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel cruelty. She felt the same neutral focus she had felt during the 470th rehearsal in her apartment. She returned the decanter to the silver tray. She stepped back. She adopted her waiting position, shoulders rounded, chin lowered, hands clasped at her waist. She became, once again, part of the furniture. By 8:30 p.m., neither man had touched his wine. This was a problem neither of them would acknowledge openly. Kwon Sung-jin never drank first at a negotiation. It was a ritual so ingrained he no longer thought about it consciously. The first to drink is the first to surrender, the first to say I trust you not to have poisoned me. He had survived 23 years in his industry by ensuring he was always the second to drink. Yoon Ha-jin was not drinking either. Because his plan required Kwon to drink first. He needed the principal's glass emptied, the compound delivered, the timeline started, before he himself committed to the same liquid. The silence around the untouched glasses grew heavier with every passing minute. At 8:31, Kwon made his decision. He reached for his glass. Slowly. Deliberately. Then he paused. He turned to Yoon. Together. It was not a request. It was a command dressed as fellowship. The implication was the oldest trust ritual in organized power: if we drink together, neither of us has poisoned the other. Because no rational man poisons a glass he himself must drink from. That logic had never failed. It had also never been tested by someone like Ozioma. A micro-expression flickered across Yoon's face, a contraction of the muscle around his left eye that lasted less than a quarter of a second. Surprise. Not at the proposal. At the timing. He had expected Kwon to drink alone, on his own terms, leaving Yoon free to abstain or to delay until the principal's symptoms began. The simultaneous toast forced a calculation he had not prepared for. If he refused, suspicion. If he accepted, he would drink the wine he himself had poisoned. He raised his glass. To clarity, he said. To the future, Kwon replied. They drank. Kwon set his glass down first. He inhaled through his nose, a sommelier's habit he had adopted decades ago, the final act of appreciation before the wine's essence dissipated. His expression was unchanged. He was relaxed. The wine was exactly as it should be, complex, layered, alive with the sedimentary memory of a French hillside. He did not know that 20 seconds earlier, that wine had contained something that would have ended more than the evening. He did not know it had been neutralized. He simply drank, and lived, and continued. Yoon set his glass down 4 seconds later. His expression was also composed, but the quality of his composure was different. It was the composure of a man who had just committed an irreversible act based on the certainty that it would destroy someone else, and who now had to wait for confirmation. He did not yet know that the only person that act would destroy was himself. Park Do-han, behind Kwon's chair, allowed himself a microsecond of relief. The toast had gone cleanly. The evening was proceeding according to protocol. His threat assessment indicators were green across the board. He adjusted his earpiece and murmured a status confirmation to the two-man team monitoring from the 45th floor. He did not report anything about the waitress. There was nothing to report. She was furniture. The negotiation continued. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Then 40. And Kwon Sung-jin showed no symptoms at all. But someone else did. This is the moment most viewers expected the powerful man to fall. He didn't. Because the most dangerous person in the room had already rewritten the ending 45 minutes ago, and the man who built the trap is about to discover whose grave he was actually digging. If this story is making you reconsider every powerful person you've ever underestimated yourself to, share it with the one person in your life who needs the same reminder. Drop a single word in the comments: patience. At 8:53 p.m., Yoon Ha-jin excused himself to the restroom. This was his first deviation from his original timeline. According to the schedule he had constructed with his own organization, a schedule he had not written down anywhere, not stored on any device, not communicated to any subordinate after the planning phase, he should have remained at the table for the entire duration of the evening, observing Kwon's deterioration in real time, ensuring that no medical intervention could be summoned in time to save him. But his body had begun to register an unfamiliar sensation. A faint flush in the cheeks. A subtle increase in the rate of his pulse. A sensation in the base of his throat that was not yet alarming but was outside the parameters of normal post-meal physiology. He attributed it, in those first minutes, to nervousness. He attributed it to the weight of what he had set in motion. He attributed it to anything other than the only true explanation, because the only true explanation was structurally impossible within his understanding of what had occurred. He returned to the dining room at 9:07. When he entered, something had shifted in his physiology that only Ozioma could detect. The faint sheen of perspiration she had noticed during the toast was now slightly more pronounced, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not actively monitoring him for exactly this kind of change. His fingers, when they returned to the table, trembled for approximately 1/10 of a second before he stabilized them by gripping the edge of his chair. He had consumed the substance he had intended for someone else. And his body, beneath the expensive charcoal gray fabric and the practiced composure, was beginning to respond. Kwon noticed nothing. He was deep inside a movie of himself winning, and he was so far inside that movie he had stopped checking whether the projector was even on. He continued the negotiation from the exact point where it had paused, reciting terms with the methodical patience of a man who had memorized the entire architecture of the deal. Yoon nodded. He agreed to a provision he would have contested 40 minutes ago. He conceded a territorial point that his organization had fought over for 3 years. Kwon registered these concessions as evidence of successful negotiation, the natural result of his own dominance and strategic superiority. He did not consider the possibility that Yoon's sudden agreeableness was not strategic but physiological. That the man across the table was agreeing because his cognitive resources were being redirected, not toward negotiation, but toward the increasingly difficult task of maintaining the appearance of normalcy while his internal systems began to register that something was profoundly wrong. By 9:20 p.m., Yoon's blink rate had elevated. His respiration had increased by 4 breaths per minute. His left hand had migrated below the table, where Ozioma estimated he was pressing his palm against his thigh to suppress a fine motor tremor. He was still performing the negotiation. He was still speaking in complete sentences. He was still meeting Kwon's gaze. But the architecture of his composure was beginning to show stress fractures, hairline cracks visible only to someone who knew exactly what to look for. Ozioma stood at the periphery and watched. She understood what was happening with a clarity no one else in the room possessed. She understood that her objective had succeeded, that Kwon's glass had been safe, that the foreign compound had been neutralized, that the man at the head of the table would walk out of Hanul Tower with his life intact. And she understood, with the same neutral precision, that the man across from him would not. This was not part of her mission. This was its consequence. At 9:32 p.m., Kwon proposed a final toast. It was a ceremonial gesture, the kind of performative generosity that powerful men extend when they have already secured everything they wanted. He lifted his glass with the theatrical slowness of a conductor raising a baton for the final movement. Yoon hesitated. It was a hesitation measured in fractions, perhaps 3/4 of a second longer than a natural response. Kwon did not notice. Park Do-han did not notice. But Ozioma noticed, and she understood what it meant. He was recalculating. His substance should have begun to affect Kwon by now. The timeline he had been given indicated that symptoms should have appeared within 30 to 45 minutes of ingestion. It had now been over an hour. Kwon showed no symptoms. No perspiration. No tremor. No cognitive drift. Nothing. His plan had failed. And now he was holding a glass of wine that had been drawn from the same decanter he had arranged to contaminate, and realizing, with a dawning clarity Ozioma could read in the microcontraction of his pupils, that the substance was working. Just not on the person it was intended for. He raised his glass anyway. He had no choice. To refuse the toast would invite the kind of scrutiny his current physiological state could not withstand. He met Kwon's eyes and performed a smile that cost him everything he had left. To the future. The same words Kwon had used earlier. An echo. A capitulation. They drank. Kwon swallowed the remainder of his wine and set the glass down with finality. The deal, in his mind, was concluded. The evening was a success. His empire had expanded by exactly the margin he had calculated, and his rival had submitted with precisely the degree of resistance that made the submission feel earned rather than engineered. He turned to Park Do-han and gave a single nod, the signal that the evening was concluding satisfactorily and that departure protocols could begin. Park spoke into his earpiece. Arrangements were initiated. An elevator was summoned. Exit routes were confirmed. None of this included any consideration of the woman who had ensured the principal would be alive to give that nod. At 9:41 p.m., Yoon stood. The act of standing required him to redistribute his weight in a way that exposed the degree to which his equilibrium had been compromised. He placed one hand on the table, ostensibly a casual gesture, the kind of thing anyone might do when rising from a deep chair. But the pressure he applied to the table's surface was not casual. It was structural. He was using the table to compensate for a vestibular system that was no longer operating at full capacity. He extended his hand to Kwon. They shook. Kwon's grip was firm, measured, dominative. Yoon's grip was slightly weaker than it should have been, but not so weak that it registered as abnormal to anyone who was not measuring it against a documented baseline. He turned and walked toward the corridor. His gait was controlled. His stride was even. But to Ozioma, who had spent the last 90 minutes tracking every physiological variable she could observe, the control was performative. He was walking the way a sober person walks when trying to prove they are sober. Every step deliberate. Every movement conscious. The automaticity of natural movement had been replaced by the mechanical precision of effort. He disappeared into the corridor. Whatever happened to him next was beyond the scope of this room, this evening, and Ozioma's assignment. Kwon remained seated for another 4 minutes. He finished a glass of water. He straightened his cufflinks. He gazed at the empty chair where his rival had been sitting and allowed himself a moment of private satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction that does not need witnesses because it is performed entirely for oneself. He believed he had won through superiority. Through strategic architecture. Through the immovable force of his own reputation and the structural impossibility of resistance. He did not know that he had won because a woman he had never seen had altered an equation he had never known existed. His victory was real. The reason for it belonged to someone else entirely. One man walked out of that room celebrating a victory he did not earn. The other walked out carrying a death he had built with his own hands. And the only person who knew the truth was already preparing to disappear. Tell me, would you have warned him? Or would you have stayed silent and let the trap close around the man who built it? Comment your honest answer below. Share this video with the one person in your life who has been treated as invisible for too long. They deserve to see what invisibility can become when it is wielded with discipline. At 9:47 p.m., Kwon Sung-jin departed. His exit was efficient and unremarkable, Park Do-han preceding him into the corridor, the elevator summoned, the descent executed in silence. He did not look back at the dining room. He did not thank the service staff. He did not, at any point during the evening, acknowledge through word or gesture that the three people who had served his food and wine were sentient beings with names and interior lives. This was not unusual. It was protocol. The staff existed to facilitate the evening, not to participate in it. The dining room was quiet now. The chandelier still burned. The empty glasses still held their residue of burgundy. The pressed linen napkins had been displaced from their architectural folds into the organic shapes of use, crumpled, draped, abandoned. Ozioma began clearing the table. She moved with the same rehearsed efficiency she had used all evening. She collected the glasses onto a tray, the stems aligned in parallel. She retrieved the empty decanter. She gathered the napkins. She worked in silence, in shadow, with the meticulous care of someone who understood that the final moments of any operation are the most dangerous, because they are the moments when discipline is most likely to relax. Hers did not. The two other service staff members, the men she had worked alongside for 5 weeks, moved through their own routines. They had no knowledge of what had occurred during the pour. They had seen nothing because there had been nothing visible to see. They would complete their tasks, change out of their uniforms in the service corridor locker room, and go home to apartments where they would think about nothing related to this evening. They were genuine staff. They were exactly what they appeared to be. Only Ozioma was not what she appeared to be. And even she, in the final minutes of the evening, appeared to be nothing more than a woman cleaning up after men who had never bothered to notice her. At 10:03 p.m., she carried the final tray into the service corridor. The corridor was stainless steel and fluorescent light, a deliberate aesthetic contrast to the amber opulence of the dining room. It was designed to remind the staff that they existed in a different world from the one they served. The temperature was cooler. The surfaces were harder. The lighting was clinical. It was a decompression chamber between performance and reality. She placed the tray on the steel counter. She removed her vest and hung it on the assigned hook. She retrieved her personal belongings from a small locker, a plain black canvas bag containing a change of clothes, a phone, and nothing else. She changed in a single-occupancy restroom at the end of the corridor, black jeans, a gray pullover, flat shoes. She removed her earrings and placed them in a zippered pocket. She released her hair from the bun and let it fall to her shoulders. In 90 seconds, she was no longer waitstaff. She was no one again. A different kind of no one. She exited through the staff entrance on the building's ground floor, a service door that opened into an alley between Hanul Tower and a parking structure. There were no cameras in the alley. This was not a security oversight, it was an architectural concession to the building's legitimate staff, who had negotiated the right to smoke and take breaks without being recorded. It was a small blind spot in a building that prided itself on comprehensive surveillance. She had identified this blind spot on her 3rd day of employment. She walked 3 blocks east to a subway station. She descended the stairs. She purchased a single-ride ticket from an automated kiosk. She boarded a train headed south. She sat in a window seat near the center of the car, placed her bag on her lap, and closed her eyes. She did not look relieved. She did not look triumphant. She looked like someone who had completed a task that required extraordinary precision and sustained pressure, and who was now allowing her nervous system to return to baseline in the way that only trained operatives can, not through celebration or release, but through the deliberate cessation of vigilance. 6 stops south, she exited the train. She walked another 4 blocks through a quiet residential district. The neighborhood was the kind that did not appear on any tourism map, modest, lived in, uninteresting to anyone who did not already live there. She entered a small apartment building through a side door, climbed 2 flights of stairs, and let herself into a unit on the 2nd floor. The apartment was small. Spare. There were no photographs. No personal artifacts. No indication that anyone had lived there for longer than a few weeks. This had been her home for 9 months. By the end of next week, it would be empty. She sat at the small wooden table. She did not turn on the overhead light. The streetlight outside the window provided enough illumination for her to see the surface of the table and her own hands resting on it. She thought about Kwon Sung-jin. Not with hatred. Not with satisfaction. With the strange, neutral clarity of someone who had spent 18 years carrying the weight of a single name and was now, finally, no longer required to carry it. The transaction that had occurred 18 years ago, the transaction that had brought her to this apartment, to this city, to this profession, had not been about money. It had been about a person. A person Kwon Sung-jin had erased from the world without ever knowing her name. A person Kwon Sung-jin had ordered eliminated as a routine business decision, the way a man might order the removal of a piece of furniture that no longer fit a redesigned room. That person had been Ozioma's older sister. Tonight had not been revenge. If it had been revenge, she would have allowed the substance to remain in his glass. She would have allowed Yoon's plan to succeed. She would have walked out of Hanol Tower knowing that Kwon Sung-jin was dying alone in a private dining room, never understanding that the person who had ended him was a woman whose sister he had not bothered to remember. But that outcome had not been available to her. Her actual employer, the one Emeka Abayanju had connected her to, required Kwon to remain alive. The financial structures that depended on his continued presence at the head of his organization were too complex, too interwoven, too profitable to be allowed to collapse with him. His death would have triggered a chain reaction across markets, syndicates, and intelligence networks that would have cost her actual employer more than the entire net worth of the Kwon syndicate. So she had been hired to keep him alive. And in keeping him alive, she had achieved something she suspected might be more satisfying than killing him would have been. She had become the reason he existed. He would never know. He would walk through the rest of his life believing that his survival was the natural product of his own architectural genius. He would continue to look through women like her. He would continue to dismiss the staff who served him. He would continue to operate within the same blind spot that had nearly killed him tonight. And every time he raised a glass, every time he sat down to a private dinner, every time he toasted a successful negotiation, somewhere, in a city he had never visited, a woman whose name he had never asked would know that his entire empire continued to function only because she had decided to allow it. That knowledge belonged to her. It was the only thing she would take with her when she left. The next morning, his organization would receive vague reports. Yoon Ha-jin had been admitted overnight to a private medical facility. A sudden illness. An adverse reaction. An undisclosed condition. No connection would be drawn to the dinner. No investigation would be initiated. The merger would proceed on Kwon's terms, the rival syndicate too destabilized by their leaders' collapse to mount any meaningful resistance. Kwon would interpret all of this as the natural consequence of his dominance. The universe, in his understanding, had once again confirmed what he had always known, that he was architecturally superior, strategically untouchable, and fundamentally owed the outcomes he received. He would never know about Ozioma. Not her name. Not her face. Not her 11 weeks of preparation. Not her 470 rehearsals. Not the 19 seconds that separated his continued existence from its alternative. Not the micro-container under her fingertip. Not the neutralizing agent. Not the blind spot she had identified in his building on her 3rd day. Not the subway train she had taken south. Not the gray pullover she had worn. Not the way she had closed her eyes and let her nervous system decompress with the quiet discipline of someone who had done this before and would do it again. He would never know about her sister. He would never know that the entire architecture of his life now rested on a foundation built by a woman whose existence he had refused to acknowledge. That was the point. Power, in its truest form, does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It does not require the defeated to understand they have been defeated, or the saved to understand they have been saved. It operates in silence, in invisibility, in the negative space between what powerful men believe and what actually happened. Ozioma Achebe understood this. She had built her life around it. The Hanul Tower continued to operate. The 47th floor continued to host private dinners for men who believed their security was impenetrable. The service staff continued to rotate through shifts, carrying trays and folding napkins and existing in the perceptual void between importance and irrelevance. Ozioma's position on the roster was filled within 3 days. Her replacement was a 24-year-old culinary school graduate named Minji who had no idea what the 47th floor was used for and no interest in finding out. She would work there for 2 years. She would never serve a dinner that ended in anything more dramatic than a satisfied client. She would eventually be promoted to a managerial position, retire at 63, and die at 89 without ever having understood that the floor she once served had been the site of an act of psychological warfare so refined that even the participants had not known it was occurring. Margaret Solen, the head of private dining operations, processed Ozioma's departure with the same neutral efficiency she applied to everything. She noted the date. She filed the paperwork. She did not wonder why the waitress had left. People left all the time. It was the nature of service work. You trained them, you deployed them, and eventually they moved on to other things. She did not know that the other thing Ozioma Achebe had moved on to was the same thing that had brought her to Hanul Tower in the first place. The next assignment. The next building. The next man who had built an empire on the assumption that the people who served him were not in the same category of human as he was. In the end, the evening on the 47th floor was not a story about poison. It was not a story about crime, or espionage, or the mechanics of covert action. It was a story about the oldest and most dangerous form of human blindness, the refusal to see what is right in front of you because you have already decided it is not worth seeing. Kwon Sung-jin's empire survived because of a woman he considered furniture. Yoon Ha-jin's plan collapsed because he could not conceive of a world in which a woman carrying a tray could dismantle an operation that had taken him 4 months to construct. And between them, in the space where neither man was looking, Ozioma Achebe poured the wine, neutralized the threat, cleared the table, changed her clothes, and walked out into a city that did not know her name. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one no one is watching. Tonight, that person walked away from a tower full of cameras, security personnel, and powerful men, and not a single one of them saw her leave. But here is the question that should keep you awake tonight. How many rooms in your own life, right now, this week, this year, contain a person you have stopped looking at? The waiter refilling your water at the restaurant. The driver delivering your packages. The cleaner moving through your office at the end of the day. The person at the next desk whose name you have forgotten. The relative who stopped speaking up at family dinners because no one ever asked their opinion. Every one of them is paying attention. Every one of them is forming an understanding of you that you will never be invited to read. And one day, in a moment you will not see coming and will not understand even after it occurs, that understanding will translate into action. It might save you. It might not. The decision will not be yours. The decision will belong to the person you stopped watching. That is the lesson of the 47th floor. That is the lesson Kwon Sung-jin will never learn. That is the lesson Yoon Ha-jin learned too late. And that is the lesson Ozioma Achebe will continue to teach, quietly, invisibly, in rooms full of people who refuse to see her, for as long as powerful men keep underestimating the patience of the ones who serve them. Tell me honestly. What would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments. The most thoughtful response will be pinned. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet operators who shape outcomes the powerful never see coming. And share this video with the one person who needs to be reminded that being underestimated is not a weakness, it is, when wielded correctly, the most precise weapon a human being can carry. Stay watching. Stay patient. The world is full of 47th floors.